Hey guys, enjoy the viewing.
When the invitation arrived, I didn't think twice. A private island, an all-expenses-paid reunion with college friends, and a chance to reconnect with people I hadn't seen in a decade. It sounded perfect. David, the host and a now multimillionaire tech mogul, had always been eccentric, but he was generous. I couldn't say no. The island was breathtaking. Lush forests, sprawling beaches, and a mansion that seemed to hover above the cliffs. We arrived in staggered groups, 8 of us in total, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times. David greeted us with his signature grin, though his eyes held a sharpness I didn't remember. "The game starts tomorrow," he said, raising a glass of champagne. We laughed, assuming it was just one of his antics. The next morning, the first note appeared. It was slipped under my door, written in neat block letters. "Find a chest by the lagoon before noon. Trust me, you don't want to lose." The others received similar instructions, each tailored to their personalities. There was a thrill to it at first, a childlike excitement as we scrambled around the island, racing against time. But then the clues turned personal. "Remember the bet you made freshman year?" One note read, addressed to Mark, the life of the party back then. His face went pale as he crumpled it, muttering something about a mistake he'd long buried. By midday, the notes grew darker. They referenced secrets we thought only we knew, things we'd never shared, even with each other. By evening, the air was thick with suspicion. Melissa accused Adam of writing the notes to mess with us, but he swore he wasn't behind it. I cornered David, demanding an explanation, but he just smiled. "You'll understand soon enough," he said cryptically before disappearing into the mansion. That night, we gathered in the grand dining hall, tension crackling like static. The meal was exquisite, but no one touched their food. Instead, we whispered among ourselves, trying to piece together what was happening. Just as the clock struck midnight, the lights flickered, and a projector whirred to life on the far wall. David's voice filled the room. "Do you remember what you did to me?" The screen flashed images of a younger David, the awkward kid we used to tease mercilessly. He played the fool to fit in, and we let him. The clips grew darker. Pranks that crossed the line, moments we'd all conveniently forgotten. Then came a video of us laughing, oblivious, as he stumbled away from a party in tears. "This game isn't for fun," the voice continued. "It's for justice." Panic erupted. Melissa bolted for the door, but it was locked. Adam tried to smash a window, only to find them reinforced. David's voice laughed as we scrambled like trapped animals. "You're not leaving until the game is finished." The final twist came when we found a note on the dining table, a single sentence scrawled in red ink. "Only one of you gets to leave." By dawn, alliances had crumbled. Mark and Melissa accused each other of sabotaging the group, while Adam and I tried to find another way out. But the real horror came when we realized David had been watching us the entire time, through cameras hidden in every corner of the mansion. And then the power cut out. The last thing I remember is the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall, growing louder, and David's voice over the intercom, chilling in its calmness. "The game isn't over yet." The email landed in my inbox at exactly 2:17 p.m. I remember the time vividly because I was sitting in the kitchen watching my daughter Lily chase her little brother Max around the backyard. I almost ignored it. Just another piece of spam, I thought. But then I saw the subject line. "Your family is not safe." My heart stuttered as I clicked it open. The message was simple, almost clinical. "Transfer $20,000 in Bitcoin to the attached wallet address within 24 hours. If you don't, you'll never see your children again." Beneath it was a link to a live video feed. The image that loaded made my blood run cold. It was Lily in Max's classroom, taken from an angle that only the security camera could provide. The two of them were sitting at their desks, Max wiggling in his chair, Lily doodling on the corner of her paper. Unaware. Innocent. I scrambled to call the school, my hands trembling as I dialed. The secretary answered on the third ring, her voice annoyingly chipper. "Everything is fine, Mr. Harris," she assured me. "Our security system is intact. No cameras have been hacked." But I knew what I'd seen. The second email came an hour later. "Don't call the police. Don't involve anyone. Transfer the money now." This time the attached video feed showed my house. The camera angle was odd, high up like it had been taken from the trees lining our backyard. Max was sitting on the swing set, kicking his legs in rhythm. Lily was spinning in circles, her laughter silent but visible. I rushed outside, scanning the tree line, my heart pounding in my ears. "Lily! Mux!" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. They turned to me, confused but unharmed. The relief was short-lived. A third email arrived as I tucked them into bed that night. This one had no text, just a single attachment. I hesitated before opening it, a knot of dread coiling in my stomach. It was a video of me, standing outside the house earlier, calling for my children. The camera followed me, zooming in on my face, my shaking hands. Someone had been there watching. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak of the house. I kept the lights on, the blinds drawn, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The demands escalated the next day. More money, specific instructions on how to transfer it. The video feeds continued, each one more invasive than the last. They knew everything: when my wife left for work, when I walked the dog, what cereal my kids ate for breakfast. By the third day, I caved. I transferred the money, praying it would be enough. But the emails didn't stop. The final message came with a single line of text. "You should have done this sooner." Attached was a photograph of my wife's car, taken from directly behind as she pulled out of the driveway. I bolted outside, phone in hand, and called her. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard it, a shrill scream, echoing faintly through the woods that bordered our house. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, shouting her name, but all I found was her phone, discarded in the dirt. The screen was shattered, and the email she'd received was still open. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Look closer, Mr. Harris. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't random. It was personal. Years ago, I'd been part of a startup tech company, a small team working out of a dingy office, chasing big dreams. We built software, tested prototypes, and spent late nights dreaming of the big time. But when success finally came, I made a choice. I sold the company behind my partner's back, cutting him out of the profits entirely. He'd always been a quieter one, the guy in the background. I thought he wouldn't fight back. I was wrong. The email stopped after that day, but the damage was done. My wife was never found, and I moved my children across the country, changing their names, their schools, their lives. Every time I check my inbox, I hold my breath, waiting for the past to find me again. And I know it's only a matter of time. I woke up to the sound of shouting. Not the regular kind you hear in a crowded city. Arguments spilling out of open windows, vendors barking their prices on the street. This was different, panicked, and urgent. When I looked outside, the street below was flooded with people, all craning their necks toward the ends of the block. I couldn't see what they were looking at, but I felt it. Something was wrong. I threw on a jacket and headed downstairs. The building's lobby was already packed with tenants, everyone murmuring, their voices low and wary. Mr. Ahmed, who ran the corner bodega, was talking to the super, his voice trembling. They're saying no one can leave. Armed guards at both ends. Why would they do that? I pushed my way outside, the cool morning air doing little to calm my nerves. True enough, there were armed guards stationed at both exits of the block. Their uniforms were unmarked, their faces impassive beneath mirrored sunglasses. One of them barked at a man trying to pass, his rifle slung casually across his chest. Back inside, he ordered. The man shouted something back, but a raised rifle silenced him. I could feel the unease spreading. Phones were out, faces illuminated by frantic Google searches. No news, no announcements, nothing. The first whispers started around noon. Someone claimed they'd heard a guard say quarantine. Someone else said it was a gas leak. A woman down the block swore it was some kind of military drill. None of it added up. By the second day, tension was boiling over. Supplies were dwindling. People were pooling what they had, but it was chaos. Fights broke out in the street. A loaf of bread here, a bottle of water there. The guards didn't intervene. They just watched. It was almost worse than if they had done something. It made them feel inhuman, detached. I spent the next night lying awake, listening to the muffled sounds of arguments echoing through the building. Every creak and groan of the old structure made my stomach twist. What were they waiting for? On the third day, a rumor swept through the block. Someone inside was the reason for the lockdown. It spread like wildfire. People started pointing fingers, whispering about odd neighbors or strange behavior they'd noticed. Mrs. Gonzalez from 3B swore she'd seen the guy in 4C sneaking out late at night with something under his coat. Someone else claimed to have seen hazmat suits in his apartment through the window. By nightfall, the mob had formed. I watched from the window as they pounded on his door, shouting for answers. He opened it, wide-eyed and pale, his hands raised. "I don't know what's happening either," he cried. They didn't believe him. They dragged him into the street, screaming accusations. One of them even threw a punch. That's when the guards stepped in. It happened fast, 2 loud cracks that echoed off the buildings. The crowd scattered, and the man lay crumpled on the pavement, his blood pooling in the cracks of the asphalt. The guard said nothing, simply dragging his body out of sight. No one spoke for the rest of the night. The fourth day brought silence. No one dared venture outside. Windows were shuttered, doors locked. We all sat in the dim, stale air of our apartments, the weight of fear pressing down like a stone. Who else would they come for? I tried calling the police again, but the line didn't even ring. My cell phone was useless. The signal had vanished. As the sun set, the shadows in my apartment stretched long and thin, like fingers creeping toward me. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching at my door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate scrape, like nails on wood. I crept to the peephole, every step making my heart pound harder. I peered through, expecting to see one of my neighbors, or worse, a guard. But the hallway was empty. When the scratching came again, it was louder, sharper. I backed away, suddenly aware of how thin my door was, how easily it could be breached. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet, and waited, my back pressed against the wall, every muscle tensed. The noise stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I was shaking from exhaustion. I looked out the window and saw that the guards were gone. Just like that. The barricades, the rifles, the silent menace. They had vanished without a trace. I stepped outside cautiously, half expecting a trap. Others emerged, equally wary. No one spoke. The street was eerily empty, save for the man's bloodstains still etched into the asphalt. No explanation ever came. No news coverage, no reports. Just silence. But every time I hear the faint scrape of something against my door, I remember. We weren't locked in to protect us from the outside. We were locked in to protect the outside from us. When Mr. Bennett called, I thought it was just another consultation. My job was straightforward. Help retirees manage their wealth. Ensure their golden years were, well, golden. But this was different. He spoke in a hushed voice, asking me to meet him at his retirement community instead of my office. "It's urgent," he said. "Not something I want on the phone." The community was stunning, almost too perfect. Manicured lawns, pastel bungalows, golf carts zipping down spotless paths. The kind of place where people went to forget their problems, not create them. But Mr. Bennett didn't look like someone at peace. He met me on his porch, his hands trembling as he gestured for me to come inside. "They won't let me leave," he whispered, glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone to burst in. I tried to probe further, but he clammed up, muttering something about needing proof before he could say more. He handed me a file, handwritten notes, copies of ledger pages, and a map of the community. "It's all there," he said, "but be careful. They don't like questions." I left feeling uneasy, the file heavy in my bag. That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table, piecing together Mr. Bennett's frantic scribbles. Most of it was incoherent rambling, but one thing stood out: a pattern of residents disappearing shortly after announcing plans to leave. Every time, their accounts were drained, their assets liquidated. The ledger was the most damning. It detailed payouts labeled exit fees, signed off by someone named Audrey Sinclair, the head of the community board. The next morning, I decided to confront her. The office was pristine, every corner staged to exude calm professionalism. Audrey greeted me with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had the kind of demeanor that screamed control, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 60s, exuding charm and menace in equal measure. "I'm here about Mr. Bennett," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Her smile faltered for the briefest moment. "Oh, what's happened now?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet. I placed a ledger on her desk. "He's worried about these so-called exit fees." Audrey's expression hardened. She leaned back, steepling her fingers. "It's all in the contract," she said coolly. "Every resident agrees to our terms. I'm sure you understand how necessary it is to maintain order in a community like this." I didn't like the way she emphasized order. "And the disappearances?" I pressed. "What about those?" Her smile returned, sharper now. "Mr. Bennett is prone to exaggeration. I'm sure you've noticed." I left her office with more questions than answers. When I returned to Mr. Bennett's bungalow, the door was ajar. I stepped inside, calling his name. No response. The living room was eerily empty, the furniture untouched, but the air felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't quite place. His desk had been cleared out, the papers I'd seen the day before nowhere in sight. A single piece of paper lay on the dining table. Sometimes it's better not to ask. I bolted outside, searching for any sign of him. A maintenance worker in a golf cart passed by, and I flagged him down. "Have you seen Mr. Bennett?" The man shook his head, not meeting my eyes. "Moved out this morning," he muttered before driving off. The next day, I returned to the community, determined to get answers. But when I reached the gate, the guard stopped me. "You're not authorized to enter," he said flatly. "What do you mean?" "I was here yesterday. Rules have changed." I demanded to speak with Audrey, but she was unavailable. The guard's hand hovered over his radio, and I got the message: leave or be forced to. Back at home, I tried contacting Mr. Bennett, but his phone was disconnected. His email bounced back. It was as if he'd never existed. A week later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, a blurry shot of me leaving Audrey's office. Scrawled on the back were 3 words: "This is over." I quit my job the next day, but I couldn't let it go. The community still advertises itself as the pinnacle of luxury living. Its brochures plastered with smiling retirees and promises of carefree golden years. But I know better, and I wonder how many of them will try to leave. I've been chasing the story for weeks. Each new lead only added to the pattern I was uncovering, but no one seemed willing to believe me. Car accidents happen every day. They're tragic, yes, but hardly suspicious. Unless, of course, all the victims are whistleblowers. It started when I was researching a whistleblower case about a pharmaceutical company. The man who had leaked documents about falsified drug trial results had died in a fiery crash just days before he was set to testify. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck. But then I found another case. A chemical engineer exposing unsafe practices at a manufacturing plant. Same story, same outcome. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Witnesses in lawsuits, corporate insiders, even journalists, they all died in accidents too neat to be random. And now, the same company names were showing up again and again in the background of their lives. This wasn't coincidence. It was a hit list. I knew the risk I was taking. My editor thought I was chasing ghosts, but I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me. People didn't just disappear without reason. Not like this. I had to expose them. Then I got the email. I was sitting in my cramped apartment, reviewing my notes for the 100th time, when my laptop dinged. The sender was anonymous. The subject line was blank. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but curiosity won out. You're next. Stop digging. The attachment was a grainy photo of me leaving a courthouse 2 days earlier. My heart hammered as I stared at it. I'd been so careful, always looking over my shoulder, keeping my distance from suspicious cars. Yet someone had been watching. I forwarded the email to my editor, but when I called him, his response chilled me more than the photo. "You're on your own," he said, his voice tight. "This is too dangerous for us." For the first time, I felt truly alone. The next day, my car wouldn't start. It wasn't just a dead battery. The mechanic I called found my brake lines had been tampered with. Someone wanted me dead. I didn't sleep that night, barricading myself in my apartment, every sound making me jump. By dawn, I decided I couldn't stay still. I packed up my laptop, my notes, everything, and booked a room at a cheap motel on the other side of town. But they found me anyway. I had just stepped out to grab a coffee when I noticed the car, a black SUV parked across the street. The driver's face was obscured by tinted windows, but I could feel their eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I ducked into an alley, my heart pounding as I scanned for an escape. The SUV didn't follow, but I knew they weren't far. That night, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "This is your final warning." I stared at the screen, paralyzed. My instinct screamed to call the police. But what could I say? That I was being followed by ghosts? That a shadowy cabal was targeting me because I'd uncovered their scheme? No one would believe me. I considered giving up, letting the story die. But then I thought of the victims, the people who had risked everything to tell the truth, only to be silenced. I couldn't let them win. The next morning, I drove to the last address tied to the network, a plain office building on the outskirts of the city. It looked unremarkable, the kind of place you'd pass without a second thought. I parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. The lobby was empty except for a receptionist who didn't look up as I passed. I headed for the elevators, my heart thudding in my ears. The 4th floor. That was where their operations were based, according to a tip from a former employee. The elevator doors opened to a dimly lit corridor. At the end was a single door marked private. My fingers shook as I reached for the handle. Locked. Of course. I turned to leave, but a sound stopped me, a faint click like a lock being disengaged. The door swung open, and I froze. Inside was a man I didn't recognize, seated at a desk cluttered with files and monitors. He looked up, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting me. "You've come far," he said, his voice calm. "But this is where it ends." Before I could respond, 2 men appeared behind me. Their grip was iron as they dragged me back down the corridor, my protest swallowed by the empty halls. They tossed me into the stairwell, the door slamming shut behind me. When I emerged into the parking lot, the SUV was waiting. I didn't wait to see who stepped out. I ran, leaving my car and everything else behind. I've been hiding ever since, moving from town to town, staying off the grid. The story never ran. But I keep my notes close, waiting for the day I'll have the courage to finish what I started. If that day ever comes. I'd been at the job for 3 weeks when I noticed something was off. The warehouse was massive. Row upon row of conveyor belts, shelves reaching up to the ceiling, and forklifts weaving through the aisles like clockwork. It wasn't glamorous, but I needed the paycheck. The rules were strict. Keep your head down, meet your quotas, don't wander off. Especially don't wander off. No one talked about the restricted zones, though we all knew where they were. The areas were marked with bright yellow tape, the kind you'd see at a crime scene. Safety hazards, the managers said, for your protection. But the way they watched us, the way they hovered if anyone even looked too long in that direction, it felt like more than that. One night, I stayed late to finish an order. Most of the workers had clocked out, and the warehouse was eerily quiet. The hum of the conveyor belts and the faint beeping of machinery were the only sounds, but even they felt muted under the weight of the emptiness. As I loaded the last box, I heard it, a faint rhythmic beeping coming from one of the restricted zones. My curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around. No supervisors in sight. My pulse quickened as I stepped over the yellow tape, the forbidden area stretching out before me. The beeping grew louder as I moved deeper into the zone, past rows of pallets stacked high with unmarked boxes. Then I saw them. Medical beds lined up in perfect rows, each one occupied. People. They were lying there, motionless, hooked up to machines. The rhythmic sound was their heart monitors. I crept closer, my breath shallow, and peered at the nearest bed. The man's face was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. His chest rose and fell in time with the beeps, but his eyes were shut, and his body was unnervingly still. "What the hell?" I whispered. "Step back," a voice barked behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering. It was my supervisor, his face stone cold. 2 other men stood behind him, their expressions unreadable. "I got lost," I stammered, trying to sound innocent. "Lost, huh?" His lips curled into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's get you back to your station." He grabbed my arm, his grip like steel, and practically dragged me out of the restricted zone. I wanted to protest, to ask questions, but the look on his face silenced me. He wasn't angry. He was scared. The next morning, I found a note in my locker, "Stay in your lane." I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Who were those people? Why were they hooked up to machines? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something illegal, something inhuman, was happening here. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the note until the words blurred. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a car idling outside. I peered through the blinds and saw a black sedan parked across the street. It didn't move, the driver hidden behind tinted windows. The next day, the sedan was there again, and the day after that. By the end of the week, I was unraveling. My supervisor's warning echoed in my head, but I couldn't let it go. I started digging, online forums, news archives, anything that might explain what I'd seen. That's when I stumbled on it, a thread about human optimization experiments. It sounded like conspiracy theory garbage at first, but the details matched. A corporation testing on unwilling subjects. Warehouse sites. No survives. I decided to quit. I packed my things after my shift, planning to hand in my badge and walk out the door. But as I reached the exit, I saw them. 2 men in suits standing by the time clock. They weren't workers. They weren't supervisors. And they were watching me. I turned back, pretending I'd forgotten something. My heart pounded as I ducked into the bathroom, my mind racing. They knew. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a dingy motel, paying in cash, and kept my phone off. The next morning, I drove 2 towns over to stay with a friend. I told her I needed time to figure things out. I didn't mention the warehouse, or the people in the beds, or the men in suits. But it didn't matter. A week later, I found another note on my windshield. We're still watching. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know I'll never be free of them. And I'll never forget the sight of those motionless bodies, lying in rows under the cold, fluorescent lights. I was scrolling through my email during a slow afternoon when I saw it. My own obituary. At first, I thought it was some morbid joke. The headline read, "In loving memory of Thomas Reed." My full name, complete with my birth date. The date of death? Yesterday. The attached obituary was unervingly thorough. It mentioned my work as a financial analyst, my love for hiking, and even the cat I'd adopted a year ago. It also listed a memorial service scheduled for Saturday. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I was alive, wasn't I? I called my sister, half expecting her to laugh and admit she was behind it. But she picked up, her voice tight with grief. "Tom," she whispered. "Is this you?" "Yes, it's me," I said, baffled. Why wouldn't it be? Her silence stretched until I thought the line had gone dead. Then she said, "I got a call this morning from someone claiming they were from the hospital. They said you were gone." "I'm fine," I assured her. "It's a mistake." "Then why can't I reach your apartment?" she asked. "Why does it say someone else lives there now?" I froze. I hadn't been home all day, but it was my apartment. My name was on the lease. I hung up and drove straight there, my mind spinning. When I arrived, the locks had been changed. A stranger answered the door, a middle-aged man in a bathrobe. "Can I help you?" he asked, blinking at me like I was the intruder. "This is my apartment," I said, my voice shaking. He shook his head. "It's been mine for 2 weeks. I just moved in." I stumbled back down the stairs, my thoughts racing. None of this made sense. My phone buzzed, a text from my bank. Account closed per customer request. Every penny I had was gone. I drove to the police station, desperation rising like bile. The officer at the front desk frowned as I explained. "You're saying you're not dead?" he asked, incredulous. "Obviously not," I snapped, pulling out my ID. Someone stole my identity, my home, my life. He took my ID, examined it, then pulled something up on his computer. His expression darkened. "There's a death certificate on file for you. Issued yesterday. It's official." I demanded to see it, and when he turned the screen, my stomach dropped. There was my name, my information, signed and stamped. The attending physician listed was someone I'd never heard of. "Who signed this?" I asked. "Dr. Elaine Harper," he replied. I recognized the name. She wasn't a stranger. I'd seen her once, years ago, when I'd gone to the hospital for stitches after a hiking accident. Why would she declare me dead? I drove to the hospital, but the receptionist told me Dr. Harper no longer worked there. She'd retired 6 months ago. "Do you have her contact information?" I pressed. She gave me a cautious look, but eventually relented. "It's against policy, but here's her address." The address led me to a modest house on the edge of the city. The curtains were drawn, and the driveway was empty. I knocked, and after a long moment, the door opened just a crack. A woman's face appeared, gaunt and shadowed by exhaustion. "Dr. Harper?" I asked. Her eyes darted around nervously. "You shouldn't be here. Why did you sign my death certificate?" I demanded. "I'm not dead." Her lips tightened, and she tried to close the door, but I caught it with my foot. "Please," I said, lowering my voice. "I just want to know what's going on." She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, her living room was cluttered with papers and files. She motioned for me to sit, but didn't meet my eyes. "I don't know who you are," she began, "but they made me sign it." "Who?" I asked. She shook her head. They came to me with documents, official ones, said it was part of an investigation, that it would keep someone safe. I didn't ask questions. Who are they? I pressed. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I can't, she whispered. You have to leave. Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with fear. Go, she hissed, pushing me toward the back door. You don't want to be here. I slipped out into the night, my pulse racing. As I reached my car, I glanced back and saw two men in dark suits enter her house. Her muffled voice carried through the still air, rising in panic. The next morning, I found another obituary. Hers. The headline read, "In loving memory of Dr. Elaine Harper." It listed her death as an accident and her contributions to medicine as her legacy. I don't know who did this or why they chose me, but every trace of my existence has been erased. My name doesn't exist in any database. My life has been stolen, and I have no way of getting it back. For now, I keep moving, staying off the grid, trying to stay one step ahead of whoever's behind this. But I can feel them closing in. I was sorting through emails late one night when the message arrived. The subject line read, "Do you know what your father did?" The sender was anonymous, and the body of the email contained nothing but an attachment, a grainy photograph. It was an old black and white image of a crime scene, the kind you'd see in a detective movie. Yellowed police tape stretched across the street, and a cluster of people stood off to the side. My stomach dropped when I recognized one of them. It was my father, much younger, standing stiffly near the edge of the scene. His face was pale, his expression frozen somewhere between fear and anger. I'd never seen him like that before. He'd never talked about anything like this. Beneath the photo was a single line of text. Ask him about the 1978 murder. My father wasn't an open book, but we'd always had a good relationship. I couldn't reconcile the man I knew, the patient, supportive father who'd taught me to ride a bike and coached my debate team, with the haunted figure in that photograph. But I couldn't let it go either. The next morning, I drove to his house. He was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the paper like always. I slid the printout of the photo across the table. "What is this?" He froze, the color draining from his face. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He reached out, almost trembling, and pulled the paper closer. "Where did you get this?" His voice was tight, controlled. "Someone sent it to me," I said. "They mentioned a murder." He looked away, his jaw clenched. "That's nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing to worry about?" I snapped. "You're standing at a crime scene. I need to know what's going on." He sighed, sinking into his chair like the weight of the world had just settled on his shoulders. "I was a witness," he admitted, "to a murder. But that was decades ago. I testified, the guy went to prison, and I put it behind me. Why didn't you ever tell me?" He hesitated, then said, "Some things are better left buried." But something in his tone didn't sit right. It wasn't just regret, it was fear. I left the house with more questions than answers. That night, another email arrived. This one contained a scanned newspaper clipping from 1978. The headline read, "Prominent businessman found dead in warehouse." The article mentioned a suspect, but what caught my attention was the description of the witness. An unnamed young man testified to hearing an argument moments before shots were fired. It was my father. He'd been the key witness. But there was something else, a footnote at the end of the article about a missing woman believed to be connected to the case. Her name was Clara Andrews. The emails kept coming over the next few days, court transcripts, photos, even an audio recording of the trial. It all painted a picture of a botched investigation. The suspect, a low-level worker, had been convicted on shaky evidence, mostly relying on my father's testimony. But the missing woman, Clara, was never found. The case was quietly closed. I confronted my father again. This time, he didn't bother denying it. I did what I thought was right, he said, his voice breaking. But there was more to it than I realized. Clara, she knew things. Dangerous things. What kind of things? He shook his head. I can't say, but I was warned to keep my mouth shut. By who? The men she worked for. That's when I realized how deep this went. My father wasn't just a witness. He'd been silenced, manipulated, forced to play a part in something much larger. And now, someone was digging it all back up. The final email came 2 days later. It contained an address, nothing more. Against my better judgment, I went. The location was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Inside, the air was damp and thick with mildew. My footsteps echoed as I crept through the space. In the center of the room was a box, sealed with duct tape. My name was scrawled across the top in black marker. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. They showed my father, Clara Andrews, and a group of men in suits, all standing together in what looked like a lavish office. There were files, too, contracts, letters, even a ledger detailing payments made to my father. But the worst was a VHS tape labeled Testimony Prep. I found an old player and watched it. The grainy footage showed my father, young and nervous, sitting across from 2 men in suits. One of them was feeding him lines, coaching him on what to say. Stick to the script, the man said. You didn't see anything else. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions. Who sent me the emails? What happened to Clara Andrews? And what had my father gotten himself into? He begged me to stop digging, but I can't. Somewhere out there, the truth is waiting, and I have to find it before it finds me. I never planned on being involved in politics. It started as a favor to a friend, a couple of hours volunteering for a congressional campaign in my district. Nothing heavy, just data entry and phone calls. But by the second week, I was pulled into something I couldn't walk away from. It was late one night when I stumbled on the file. I was inputting voter data from recent outreach efforts, checking for duplicate entries when I noticed a cluster of names that didn't match. Addresses didn't align with precincts. Birth dates were identical across dozens of entries. It was too blatant to be an accident. Hey, Greg. I called over to my supervisor. He looked up from his desk, his face lit by the glow of his screen. Yeah, something's weird with the data, I said, swiveling my laptop to show him. These names, they're fake. He frowned, leaning closer. Where'd you find this? It's all over the file we got from Central Operations. Greg's jaw tightened, and he quickly closed my laptop. Don't mention this to anyone, he said, his tone sharp. I'll take care of it. I should have left it there. But curiosity gnawed at me. That night, after everyone had left, I logged back in using a secondary account I'd created for troubleshooting. The file was gone. Not just the corrupted data, the entire record. I pulled up the system logs and found something chilling. The data hadn't been deleted. It had been moved to a private server, encrypted and locked down. Whoever did it had admin-level clearance. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. The next morning, I tried to tell Greg, but he brushed me off. Drop it, he said. You've got plenty of work without chasing ghosts. That's when I got the email. It came from an untraceable address. You've seen too much. Back off. My stomach sank as I stared at the screen. Attached was a screenshot of me, taken through my webcam, timestamped from the night before. I unplugged the laptop and threw it across the room. Someone was watching me. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my head down, but the tension in the office was suffocating. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Greg avoided me altogether. The volunteers who had been friendly now seemed wary, like they knew something I didn't. Then the threats escalated. First, my social media accounts were hacked. Photos I'd taken years ago, personal, private ones, were posted with captions twisted to make me look like a fraud. Next came the phone calls. A voice, distorted and mechanical, telling me to stay silent or face the consequences. It wasn't until my car's brakes failed on the highway that I realized how far they were willing to go. I wasn't hurt, but the message was clear. This wasn't about scaring me anymore. It was about silencing me. For good, I decided to take what I had to the media. But when I reached out to a journalist I trusted, she went quiet after our first meeting. A week later, her article on corruption in the campaign was pulled before it ever went to print. She wouldn't return my calls. I thought about quitting, walking away from it all, but I couldn't. Not when I knew what was at stake. The election was a week away, and if this data manipulation wasn't exposed, the wrong candidate, one backed by people willing to kill, would take office. Desperate, I dug deeper. Late one night, I hacked into the private server where the data had been stored. It wasn't just fake voters. It was votes. Thousands of them, preloaded and ready to swing the election. I downloaded everything, encrypting the files on a flash drive. My hands shook as I shoved it into my pocket. I didn't know where to take it. The media was compromised. The authorities? I couldn't be sure who to trust. Then the fire alarm went off. The building filled with smoke and panic erupted. As I rushed toward the exit, I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting Greg or one of his lackeys. It wasn't. The man was tall, dressed in a black suit with no identifying badge. His grip was iron as he leaned in close, his voice calm but menacing. "Leave it. I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't need to." I shoved past him, the flash drive still in my pocket. Outside, the chaos of volunteers and staff spilling into the street gave me just enough cover to slip away. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The election came and went. The candidate who shouldn't have won did, by a landslide. I sent the files to every whistleblower platform I could find, but nothing ever surfaced. I don't know if they were intercepted or ignored. Since then, I've been on the move, staying in cheap motels, changing my number, ditching my email accounts. I know they're still out there, watching, waiting for me to slip up. But I keep the flash drive with me, hidden in the lining of my bag. It's the only proof I have left. And one day, someone will listen. Someone has to. It started with an alert from my bank. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Maybe a low balance notification or a reminder about a payment due. But instead, it read, "New deposit, $2,950,000. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. It had to be a mistake. My bank account barely survived month to month, stretched thin between bills, groceries, and my wife's mounting medical costs. $2 million wasn't just out of the ordinary. It was impossible. I showed it to Anna, my wife, over breakfast. She frowned, poking at her toast. "It's probably some kind of clerical error," she said, but her voice was shaky. "You should call the bank." So I did. The woman on the other end sounded as puzzled as I was. "The funds came from an offshore account," she explained, her tone clipped and professional. "It's a verified transaction." "Who sent it?" I pressed. "I'm afraid that information is confidential," she replied. Confidential. Like I wasn't allowed to know who had just made me a millionaire. By that evening, Anna's nervousness had rubbed off on me. Every time I checked the account, the number stayed the same. $2,950,000. No errors, no reversal. It was real, and it didn't feel right. The next day, a man called me. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Mr. Carter, I'm your new financial advisor. My name is Grant. I've been assigned to help you manage your recent windfall." "I didn't hire a financial advisor," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "Of course, sir, but the transfer stipulates that you must work with me. It's part of the terms." "What terms?" My chest tightened as I paced the living room. I didn't agree to anything. Grant chuckled. Well, you did accept the deposit. I hung up on him, my hands trembling. 5 minutes later, I got an email. It was from Grant, and it contained a single line. You can't afford to ignore this. Attached was a list of instructions. They were simple at first. Invest a portion of the funds in specific stocks, purchase a few obscure assets, and maintain strict secrecy about the source of the money. The email ended with a warning. Failure to comply will result in severe consequences. Anna begged me to call the police, but I hesitated. The money was sitting in our account, untouched. What if reporting it triggered something worse? Whoever these people were, they had resources, power. Enough to deposit millions into my account without explanation. Enough to know my name, my number, and my every move. I tried to ignore the instructions, hoping it would blow over. But then, my closest friends started pulling away. At first, it was subtle, unanswered texts, missed calls. Then, one by one, they dropped out of my life entirely. I tried to ask why, but all I got were vague excuses. And then the threats started. One evening, I found a note taped to my car windshield. Time is running out. The next day, my boss called me into his office. His usual warmth was gone, replaced by a distant, uncomfortable tone. We're going in a different direction, he said. It's not personal. I was fired. Just like that. Anna and I decided to withdraw the money, hoping to return it somehow. But when I got to the bank, the teller frowned. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Your account has been flagged for restricted access. I'll need you to wait while I make a call. I didn't wait. I left the bank, my heart pounding. That night, another email arrived. It was a video this time. I hesitated before clicking play. It was footage of Anna, filmed through the window of our kitchen. She was washing dishes, oblivious to the camera trained on her. My blood turned to ice as the video ended with a single line of text. Follow the rules. I spent the next week living in fear, following their instructions to the letter. The money stayed untouched in the account, and I made the investments they demanded. Each transaction felt like signing away a piece of my soul. But no matter how much I complied, the paranoia didn't leave. I started noticing strange cars parked near our house, their engines idling late into the night. The shadows in the windows of nearby buildings felt like eyes. And then Anna disappeared. I came home one evening to find the house empty. Her purse, her phone, they were all there, but she was gone. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She's safe. Keep it that way. I don't know what they want or how far they'll go. The money sits in the account like a loaded gun, a constant reminder of the invisible noose tightening around us. Don't forget to subscribe. You are the best.